legitimacy, that it's fair, moral, and just because its rules of operation are laid out in writing. Most of the democracies, I think all of the democracies in the world today have some form of a constitution. It's typically the authoritarian governments and a few of the monarchical governments, some of the ones that are in the Middle East that, you know, it's constantly changing. There's no formal written constitution. And as a matter of fact, England is known as having a constitution, but it's a completely unwritten one. So that's kind of interesting. Um, the basis for a constitution is it lays out the blueprint for operation. Uh, it makes it difficult for a government to suddenly decide that it's going to abandon a program. Let's say that before the era of Trump, that you couldn't abandon a program or ignore certain provisions of the Constitution for any reason. Trump is pushing the limits on that. Now, the Texas Constitution is modeled in large part on the U.S. Constitution. It includes a separation of powers. As a matter of fact, Article 2 of the Texas Constitution, which is very short, I think it's one sentence, and it says that there will be a complete separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, which is not something contained in the United States Constitution. It's just become a matter of course that we recognize the separation of the different powers. But the Texas Constitution, the current Texas Constitution, actually has a specific article requiring this separation. The Texas Constitution also has some checks and balances. For example, the executive requires approval by the legislative branch. Legislative branch requires the signature of the executive. Both of them are subject to review by the judiciary. And the Texas Constitution creates a bicameral state legislature, just like the US Congress has two houses. The state legislature has two houses, and they're both basically named the same thing. You've got the Texas State Senate, and you've got the Texas State House of Representatives. How does the state of Texas even derive power in a federal government, where the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land? And that you might recall when we talked about the US Constitution, it's the 10th Amendment that creates the powers that the states have. The 10th Amendment essentially says that if the Constitution doesn't give a power to the federal government, that power belongs to the state. So the US government basically has, even though it's a very powerful government, it has a limited range of things that it can do. And if it's not contained in the Constitution or can be reasonably implied from the Constitution, then it's a state power. And so that's what the Texas state constitution tries to regulate and outline a blueprint of operation. Just like every other state in the United States, they all have constitutions. Unique to the Texas Constitution, and I'm going to explain this in greater detail in just a few minutes, we have one of the 5 weakest state governments in the United States. And that's by design. It was a result of the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War. Some of the things that happened in Texas right at the conclusion of the Civil War that gave pause to our current, the writers of our current Constitution, where they said, we cannot allow the state government to have that much power. So they've created what's considered one of the 5 weakest state governments in the United States. The Texas Constitution gives very limited power to the state legislature and even less power to the executive branch. The judiciary, surprisingly, is probably the strongest of the three branches in the state of Texas as a result of the Texas Constitution. And here's an interesting one, in which we'll talk about further as well. The bureaucracy that basically runs the day-to-day operation of the government is by far the strongest power of the Texas state government. Actually has more power to get things done, has more flexibility than the governor does, than the legislature does, and arguably more than the judiciary has. So let's get into just a little bit of Texas constitutional history, and then we'll get into a little more detail about the Constitution itself. So since 1776, the Revolution, the United States has had two governments. The first one was under the Articles of Confederation, very short-lived, and only really was functioning for about 7 or 8 years. And then, of course, by 1787, we had the United States Constitution. So it's, 240 some years, 243 years, I think it works out to. In 243 years, we've had a total of two governments of the United States. In less time than that, 1836 to the present, which 1836 was when Texas declared its independence from Mexico and created its own republic, its own country. And incidentally, let me get rid of one common misperception right now. I've heard, I don't know how many times, Texas is unique because it's the only state that was its own country at one time. And that's malarkey, to use Biden's phrase. At least 9 states were countries before they became part of the United States. One of the most obvious and most recent example, of course, is Hawaii. Used to be its own country before it became a territory of the United States, and then joined as a state to the United States. So this business about Texas being unique in that regard is nonsense. Anyway, so from 1836 to the present, we have, which is 90 years less than the American government. So in that period of time, we've had 6 constitutions. And we'll just do a real fast rundown of them. The very first constitution, 1836 to 1845, that created the Republic of Texas Constitution. Texas declared its independence from Mexico, largely to have the ability to have slavery, because the government, Texas used to be known as Tejas. It was the northernmost state of Mexico. And when Mexico started seeing the influx of Americans into the Tejas region to try and start develop a huge agricultural plantation type system, Texas is a southern state neighboring Louisiana, where they had slavery, and the thinking was that slavery could be moved into Texas. And of course, Mexico didn't like that, so they made slavery illegal. That was the prime impetus for Texas declaring its independence from Mexico, that it wanted to bring slavery. It had already brought slavery into the Texas region. Anyway, so the 1836 Republic of Texas Constitution was a virtual copy of the United States Constitution. The only real major difference in the first Constitution of Texas was that it said slavery would be a permanent institution. Come 1845, this first Constitution of Texas is going to disappear. And the reason was that Texas had asked for admission to the United States as a state. And obviously, one of the first things that the United States government is going to say is, you know, if we welcome you, you can't have a national constitution for your state. You have to abandon that and have a state constitution that recognizes the supremacy of the United States Constitution. So that happens in 1845. And just a little bit of background about why Texas asked for admission to the United States. In 1836, when it declared its independence from Mexico, Mexico didn't like that idea. And it was clear from the beginning that Mexico wasn't just going to stand back and allow its northernmost state to secede from Mexico, that there was going to be a fight over it. And, you know, no matter how much you want to denigrate the Mexican government and especially the Mexican military, they had an established military. Texas did not. How is Texas really going to stand up? This is very similar to when America declared its independence from Great Britain, the most powerful country in the world. How do you expect to win? And when Texas declared its independence, they didn't have credit, just like the United States originally didn't have credit. They didn't have a formed military. Mexico had those things. And so it was going to be a constant battle because Mexico wasn't just going to give in and give away Texas to a bunch of Americans. So 1836, or the fighting starts, and Texas needs money. It needs to sell some supplies. The cotton industry was just starting, so it developed a little bit of money for Texas. But Texas needed to fight a war against Mexico, and it started borrowing very heavily from America. And Texas kept getting deeper and deeper into debt year after year, borrowing money from the United States. And finally, around 1844, 1845, the United States government said, that's enough. We've lent you so much money and you haven't repaid any of it. We're not going to be lending you any more. And so what happens? Texas says, well, then how about if we become a state of the United States? And then you can forgive that debt and we don't need to borrow money anymore. We'll let the United States government protect us from Mexico. And so Texas becomes a state, and shortly thereafter, the United States and Mexico go to war. And now Mexico is in a different position. When they were fighting the Texans, they were the overwhelming military force. Even though they blundered a lot of things, they lost a lot of battles needlessly. But then when the United States took over Texas, it was clear that Mexico was not going to be able to fight the United States military. And of course, the United States military wound up occupying a large part of Mexico, right down to Mexico City. So anyway, so the 1845 Constitution, that was so that they could become part of the United States. That Constitution stayed into effect until 1861, just 16 years. And what happened that ended that Constitution? Texas decides to join the Confederacy. So essentially secede from the United States and join the Confederate States. And of course, the Confederate States said, well, if you're going to join us, you got to get rid of that Constitution that you had that said that you recognize the supremacy of the United States government Constitution. So they had to abandon Constitution number 2, and they created Constitution number 3. This one ran from 1861 to 1866. And it was very short. And the reason for that is, of course, the Confederacy lost the Civil War. And so Texas could no longer be part of a so-called new nation, the Confederate States of the United States, because that no longer existed, even though the North never actually formally recognized it anyway. So in 1861, the Confederate Constitution ran to 1866. And 1866, the Confederate Constitution came to an end. And here's where it gets interesting. I know the rest of it wasn't all that fascinating, but in 1866, Texas was now an occupied territory by the United States government. It hadn't been formally readmitted to the Union, and it had claimed itself as being independent of the United States. So it was an occupied area, just like all of the South was. And so the United States government developed a plan, a blueprint for the operation of the individual Confederate states, including Texas. And this was known as our Reconstruction Constitution. It was in effect from 1866 to 1869. Now, remember who was president? In 1866, Lincoln had just been assassinated the year before. And the president of the United States was Andrew Johnson, who was himself a Southerner and had Southern sympathies for the states that were in the Confederacy. And so he put together a constitution. He dictated a constitution for the state of Texas using executive power, executive authority. And it was rather benign, rather nice to the state of Texas, not punitive really in any way. And if you remember your American history, at the time, the US Congress was controlled by what they called themselves the radical Republicans, who were incensed at this. And they said the South has to be made to pay, for all of the suffering they inflicted, not only on themselves, but on the North. So by 1869, the Congress took over and said, no, we're getting rid of that constitution written by President Johnson, and we're going to create our own. So in 1869, it's known as the Radical Reconstruction Constitution. Went into effect in 1869 and lasted until 1876. Now, that was part of the construction of that Constitution, was that it was a temporary constitution, a temporary blueprint on how Texas is to operate during the period of Reconstruction and during the period of the military occupation. So it had a sort of a timeline where everybody knew that 1876 was when it was going to expire. So it was a 7-year, basically a 7-year constitution. The Radical Reconstruction Constitution, it was put into effect after Johnson was impeached. Now, you know that he wasn't removed from office, but it was just by a single vote in the Senate. So it was clear that he had lost his political mandate, and the radical Republicans in charge of Congress were going to basically run things themselves and shove Andrew Johnson aside. So this Constitution from 1869 to 1876 was much more punitive on Texas, and similar constitutions were forced upon the southern states, that had been defeated. But it was punitive, and the Texans weren't allowed to elect their own governor during the period 1869 to 1876. The governor would be appointed by Congress. And they appointed a guy named E.J. Davis. The appointment of E.J. Davis was basically a political decision. When when Texas seceded from the Union, there was a guy in Texas by the name of E.J. Davis who owned a newspaper. And he was probably the only newspaper in Texas that was opposed to the secession. He thought that it was important that Texas remain part of the Union. So you can imagine E.J. Davis was not very popular in Texas at the time, and he actually fled for his life to the north. I don't recall which state he wound up in, but he joined the military once he moved to the north and fought for the Union Army and became, I think, a colonel. I'm not sure about that. But when Congress in 1869 was thinking, so who are we going to appoint to be governor of Texas? They said, well, there's this guy, E.J. Davis. He's from Texas, but he was a supporter of the Union. So we need to put him in. And so they installed him as governor, and he did a couple of things almost immediately that that basically poisoned his political future in Texas. One of the first things that he did was he said that during this period of Reconstruction and that there were still too many anarchists running around and too many newspapers that were critical of the Union. And so as governor of Texas, he said, there will only be one official newspaper in the state of Texas. And guess which one it was? It was his. So he controlled the news media in Texas by basically declaring all other newspapers invalid, and it would only be his newspaper. One of the second things that he did was, clearly Texas needed to be reconstructed after the war. It took significant physical damage during the war, not nearly as badly as some of the other states, but still it had a lot of repairs that needed to be done. And Congress, under the radical Republicans, they weren't all that detail oriented about how the money was going to be spent on reconstruction of the state of Texas. They basically put Governor E.J. Davis in charge of the contracts to rebuild things. And of course, E.J. Davis took advantage of that, and virtually all the contracts were limited to his personal friends and family, and other people in Texas couldn't help the rebuilding. They couldn't get any of the money from the federal government. So he was unhappy, or the people of Texas were unhappy about that. And the third thing is he kind of wanted to install himself almost like a king rather than a governor. He felt that law enforcement across the state of Texas, so that included local law enforcement and statewide law enforcement like the Texas Rangers, he said he needed to have firm control over that. And so he essentially created his own military that he was in charge of. Is any of this starting to sound a little bit like Donald Trump? This was E.J. Davis. And so he had developed this military. And come 1876, which was a remarkable year in American history, it was the centennial of the United States. I guess the biggest thing was they were planning this huge centennial, 100 years of the United States in 1876, which was obviously scheduled for July 4th. And about 1 month before that, the United States military had suffered its single biggest defeat in history when Custer and his entire army was wiped out by the Indians. And so that created that created a kind of downer in the country in 1876. But now remember that this is the year that the imposed Reconstruction Constitution was to come to an end, and that the governor would now be elected by the people. The Texas legislature would now be elected by the people. So 1876, the first statewide election, E.J. Davis was so sure that he was going to win, even though he was hated by everybody. Also sounds a little bit like Donald Trump, I guess. Anyway, so he was so sure that he was going to win and was surprised when he lost by a landslide. And so he felt that he was cheated in an election, again, sounding like Donald Trump. He was cheated in an election. He was still the rightful governor of the state of Texas. And so he sent a telegram to Washington, D.C., to the president's office, basically saying he needed the army sent back into Texas to put down this insurrection that was trying to deprive him of being the legitimate government of Texas. So there was an 1876 in Washington at that time, and that was that there had been a national election and nobody won the majority of the electoral votes. I mean, does history just keep repeating itself? And so this was thrown into the House of Representatives to decide who was going to be the next president. And this went on for a while, trying to decide who the next president was going to be. But the outgoing president, and was it? I think it might have been Ulysses S. Grant. Not sure about that. But the outgoing president, he got this telegram saying, send the troops back into the South, back into Texas. And he said, you know what? It's not my problem. I'm out of here as soon as the House of Representatives determines who my successor is. So he basically just left the telegram sitting on his desk. And the battle for who was going to become president, and again, the two names escape me, but the fellow that won the 1876 election basically did it by promising that he would bring Reconstruction in the entire South to an end. And that was enough to get him elected by the House of Representatives. So he becomes president. He shows up on the first day of office. He sees this telegram from E.J. Davis, send the troops down here. Well, during that period of time when the troops weren't sent down there, E.J. Davis, remember, had developed his own military, which was the Texas Rangers and all law enforcement. They all had to report to him. He was pretty much in charge of everything. And so what he did, waiting for the new president of the United States to act, he moved into the United States to the Texas State Capitol building, the same one that's down there now. And he took over the basement and the ground floor, and he announced that he is the legitimate governor of the state of Texas. The guy who actually won the election took over the second and third floor of the same building and claimed that he was the legitimate governor of Texas. Only in Texas, I think, can you have something like that. And this went on for a couple of months until the new president was announced, and the new president sends a response to E.J. Davis that essentially said, no, I promised I'm bringing an end to Reconstruction. I'm not sending the troops back into Texas to bolster your government. And I suggest you figure out a way to safely remove yourself from the state of Texas. E.J. Davis disappears. But the result was that the people of Texas said, we will never allow a governor to have that much power to be able to do what E.J. Davis did. And so in 1876, as a response to E.J. Davis leaving, the radical Republican Constitution expiring, they write their new Constitution. This is the sixth one. And this is the one that's still in effect today, written in 1876 to the present. Because of E.J. Davis, they made sure that the executive branch of government and the governor would be the weakest governor of any governor in the United States. And that continues to today. The governor of Texas really has no enforceable powers of consequence that he can utilize by himself. Almost everything that he does requires approval by one of the other branches of government. So we have the weakest governor in the state of Texas. They also wanted to make sure that never again would a legislature be put into effect that would have the kind of control that the previous Constitution had given. And so they made sure that the Texas state legislature is what's known as a non-professional state legislature. It was designed to establish a small and limited government. It was designed to make sure there would be no professional politicians. And this is why, to this day, the members of the state legislature are paid the second least amount of any state legislator in America. There's one state, it might be New Hampshire, I think, where their state legislature, their representatives don't get paid at all. But they said that in Texas, it's going to be limited. And we'll talk more about the ramifications of that. But currently, this might be a surprise to a lot of you, a state legislator in the state of Texas currently gets paid $600 a month for the job. So $7,200 a year to be a legislator. That alone is going to create certain problems. How many people can afford to take a job like that? Retired people might be able to do it because they've already put away something for retirement. Business owners can probably do it because they've got a business to back them up. Very rich people can probably do it. And mostly everybody else couldn't take this job in the state legislature. And so what they've done, they created a non-professional legislature. They say that the people that are in it should be doing it for the good of the state and not for their, for increasing their personal income. So I guess a lot of us can recognize the argument that they shouldn't be paid a lot, but $600 a month today is, who can live on that? And the other thing is that in 1876, you had to recognize what Texas looked like. It was not the state that it is today. It didn't really have a single big city. Whereas, on the East Coast, they had New York and Boston and Philadelphia. Texas in 1876 didn't have anything that came close to that. It didn't have much industry. It probably didn't have any industry of consequence. It was agrarian, mostly the raising of cotton and cattle, but largely agrarian, very little industrialization. And it just had a natural conservative bent. Those were the things that affected the Constitution's writing in 1876, and those are the things that have been handed down to us. And you can see that there are going to be some problems with that. One was in 1876, just as an example, how many universities would a state like Texas need? When everybody lived on the farm and there wasn't really a single big city in the entire state, the thinking was one university would be enough. And so the state government, under the Constitution, written in 1876, allowed for the establishment of one university, and that was the University of Texas. And they thought that would be plenty. Well, from 1876 to now, what is that, 144 years, the state of Texas is completely different. It's pretty industrial. It's still agricultural, but the industrial end, I think, has taken over. It's the second most populated state in the United States. In 1876, it was probably one of the least populated states in the United States. So the state of Texas changed dramatically, but we were still living under this 1876 Constitution that recognized a need for a small, limited government and basically a conservative and agrarian society. So that's probably enough of the background, I guess. And I guess we kind of did slide 2 of the history of Texas too. So let's move on to slide 3.
Bob, is it true that Texas can divide into 2 or 3 states?
The agreement when Texas was readmitted to the United States, there was a written document that contains a lot of stuff that, again, is some kind of misconception of a lot of people. One of the misconceptions, and I'm going to go to this one first and then to your question. One of the misconceptions was, well, Texas was its own country at one time, and upon readmission to the United States, it retained the power to secede from the United States again, anytime that it wanted to. And there were a lot of people that go around saying Texas can secede at its will because that was part of the agreement in 1845 when it became a state in the United States. Well, that was abrogated once they seceded. And essentially, can they secede again? Yeah, they're given the right to fight the Civil War all over again. No, that is not the case. And that same document did say that Texas, because its size was so big, in 1845, they said that we'll treat it kind of as quasi-territory, and therefore it could be divided up into multiple states. But again, that disappeared after after Texas seceded. And currently, and Warren, you were here for that first session that we did. It says that no state can create additional states within its borders without the approval of Congress. And so this nonsense about, well, Texas has the right to divide into actually 4 states was what that document had said. The Constitution of the United States would say only if Congress agrees, and Congress is never going to agree to that. So that takes care of that issue of the states. Okay, any other questions about some of that history before we start talking in a little detail? Now, I told you this Constitution is 273 pages long compared to 7 pages of the US Constitution. State constitutions are typically longer because they've got to go into great detail about, some kind of mundane things. So some of the articles in the Texas Constitution go to things like water rights, who owns the water under the ground, who owns the water on top of the ground. It goes to land grants, because most of Texas ownership was based on Mexican land grants. So, I mean, these are things that are unique for Texas, and they have whole articles in the Constitution referring to that. We're going to skip over a lot of that stuff. If you're interested in water rights and Mexican land grants, you can read that section of the Texas Constitution yourself. But so now first, just a real fast overview of the Constitution. It contains a preamble, just like the US Constitution, and it has then 17 articles, whereas the US Constitution only has 7. They have 17, but I just explained they have to go into more detail on more mundane things. That's why it's so long. Interestingly enough, in Texas, when they passed constitutional amendments, or even things that were contained in the 1876 Constitution that limited voting rights to, white males over the age, and I think you had to have property ownership to be able to vote. All of those things have been ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. Most states that had provisions like that would rescind those provisions. The state of Texas leaves them in. For some reason, they just don't want to get rid of some of the things. I'm thinking maybe if the Supreme Court composition changes, we'll be able to go back to things like segregation and an all-white primary and no women voters. These things are still in the Texas Constitution. That there's a right to have a poll tax, where the Supreme Court said no. It says that only property owners can vote. They have all kinds of weird registration, property ownership requirements still contained in the Constitution that have been invalidated by the United States Supreme Court and are totally unenforceable. But rather than remove them, they leave them in there. I'd mentioned this earlier. The Texas Constitution is the longest state constitution in America. It is approaching now having 500 amendments. The U.S. Constitution has only been amended 27 times. The first 10 was the Bill of Rights. The Texas Constitution has been amended just shy of 500 times. And as a result of the amendments, the language is confused. It's become a rather unorganized document. And the Texas Supreme Court has said that it contradicts itself in a number of cases and has become virtually incomprehensible in some portions. So even the Texas Supreme Court doesn't know what the Constitution says. The Texas Constitution.
If they've done amendments, why have they not amended out the things that you were talking about? Why have they not passed amendments getting rid of only white men can vote or whatever it is?
When we get to talking specifically about the construction of the state legislature, you're going to find that the only way that you remember the U.S. Constitution can be amended two ways, and one of them was the people can call a constitutional convention. That's only been done once, but that's available. The Texas Constitution doesn't allow that. If you want an amendment, it has to be introduced in the state legislature. It has to be passed by both houses of the state legislature and then voted on by the people. Both houses of the state legislature, they could never get them to agree on these things. The most recent one, of course, is in the Texas Bill of Rights. I think the very last one, or the second to the last one, says that marriage in the state of Texas shall be between one man and one woman, period. The United States Supreme Court has invalidated that. There have been attempts in the state legislature to have that removed, and the way to remove it is to amend the Constitution. And one or both houses couldn't agree, and so it never even went to a vote to the people. So the ability to amend the Constitution of Texas, it's in there, but it is so difficult for the people's will to come out. The only types of amendments are those that the legislature deems that they want. And this again gets, I guess this would be a good point to put this in. The Texas Constitution is unique in the United States right now. When this Constitution was written in 1876, what I'm about to say wasn't unique, but all of the rest of the states got rid of this. The Texas Constitution, principally because of the experience under E.J. Davis, is what's known as a negative powers constitution. The US Constitution is known as a positive powers constitution. It says the president shall be able to do this and that. Congress shall be able to do these things. The judiciary has these functions. Also, the Texas Constitution is largely written as a negative powers constitution. So, example, the governor shall not be able to do this thing. The legislature shall not be able to do these things. The judiciary shall not be able to do these things. In other words, it was very limiting. The problem was, as Texas started to grow, they had a constitution that said what the government couldn't do. And they realized that there was no expression in the Constitution to say what they could do. And so that's why they had to start amending it. That's why we've got almost 500 amendments to add powers to the supposedly limited government of the state of Texas to be able to do things, to be flexible enough to go from being one of the smallest populated, largest land area states to one of the most populous and now an industrial state. So they needed to make those changes. The legislature is pretty easy on allowing amendments that help business as a result of that. But still, they have the conservative bent where they don't care so much about the rights of people. We'll probably talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, so what's our time here? I said we were going to try and keep this to an hour. So let me give you a brief introduction to the actual language of the Texas Constitution. Okay. There's some things on that slide that I hadn't. Looks like all of those things are true, but I didn't know that I was going to be seeing them. Okay. Here is the beginning, and interestingly enough, there's a preamble to the Texas Constitution, which is brief, but it kind of goes to immediately to questions about the separation of church and state. Here's the preamble to the Texas Constitution. Humbly invoking the blessings of Almighty God, the people of the state of Texas do ordain and establish this Constitution. So right off the bat in 1876, their view of the First Amendment to the US Constitution is a non-recognition of the separation of church and state. So it's the very first sentence of the Constitution of Texas. Now, they create a Bill of Rights. That's Article 1, which is surprising. The US Constitution, the Bill of Rights is at the end of the Constitution, the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights is the first section of the Texas Constitution. So let's see, get my sheet out here. Okay, the very first one of the Bill of Rights is freedom and sovereignty of the state. Texas is a free, independent state, subject only to the Constitution of the United States, and the maintenance of our free institutions and the perpetuity of the Union. Remember those words? Depend upon the preservation of the right of local self-government to all the states. So, first Bill of Rights, freedom and sovereignty of the state, says the preservation of the right of local self-government unimpaired by the states. And what's going on in the state of Texas currently about, if even going down to such things as the health regulations that are being instituted by various counties because of the coronavirus. And the state government saying, local government, you don't have the right over those things. Kind of violates the first Bill of Rights of the state of Texas. Bill of Right number 2, all political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit. Questionably now, is the legislature operating under the authority of the people and instituted for their benefit, or are the people kind of relegated to an inferior position to business and big political power interests? Section 3, or amendment, Bill of Right number 3. Equal rights. All free men, when they form a social compact, have equal rights, and no man or a set of men is entitled to exclusive, separate public emoluments or privileges, but in consideration of public services. So this goes a little farther than the U.S. Constitution on the concept of emoluments. Basically, you get, if you are a public official, the only consideration, the only payment that you are entitled to is in consideration of your public service. And so this says that you are not to get some sort of compensation from an outside source. Equality under the law. Equality under the law shall not be denied or abridged because of sex, race, color, creed, or national origin. This is an amendment that was done in 1972. Basically 8 or 9 years after the civil rights movement, 8 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that the state of Texas actually adds something to their constitution, essentially saying what the federal government required in 1964. Religious tests, and I think this one is telling. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust in this state, nor shall anyone be excluded from holding office on account of his religious sentiments, provided he acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. Witnesses are not disqualified by religious belief, so no witness can be disqualified to give evidence in a court on account of his religious opinions or for the want of any religious belief. So if you are a agnostic, all oaths or affirmations shall be administered in the mode most binding upon the conscience, and shall be taken subject to the pains and penalties of perjury. So virtually every other state, if you are going to be a witness in a trial, you have to take an oath or affirmation under penalty of perjury. And virtually every other state has eliminated this, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Most other states have gotten rid of that so help me God. Texas still allows it. It's not required, but it's allowed, and it's allowed under this section of the Bill of Rights. Freedom of worship. All men have the freedom to worship. It's a little more detailed than the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. One interesting line here: it shall be the duty of the legislature to pass such laws as may be necessary to protect equally every religious denomination in the peaceable enjoyment of its own mode of public worship. Building on that concept of appropriations for sectarian purposes. No money shall be appropriated for the benefit of any sect or religious society, theological or religious seminary, nor shall property belonging to the state be appropriated for any such purposes. And this is going to raise the question, no money from the state treasury can be used for the benefit of any sect or religious society. What about a religious school? Does this prohibit the state from giving money to a religious school? You can see that this is ripe for litigation, if not just plain out discussion. Some of the later rulings were that if a religious organization is operating an educational institution, it can be treated as if it's an educational institution, and therefore the state can give it money. But there is always this battle about, does it violate this portion of the Texas Constitution? You've got the freedom of speech and press, searches and seizures, rights of the accused in criminal prosecutions, bail. These things are in greater detail here, but very similar to the US Constitution's Bill of Rights. One thing that they did create here, and this was in 1993, they amended this issue about bail. You recall that in the United States Constitution, no unreasonable bail can be imposed. That created a number of lawsuits, especially in Texas. So they put an amendment to this right to bail, saying that it's a full page long, talking about if a person has committed a violent offense, if the case is about murder, aggravated assault, kidnapping, a sexual offense, if the person has been convicted of a felony before, all of these things can be considered in denying bail. But of course, if the bail is denied under these circumstances, you could see a federal lawsuit saying that it violates the US Constitution's right to bail. And this whole thing about bail, it goes on for well over a page. Denial of bail if there's a protective order involving family violence. So you can see that some of these things go into much more detail in the Constitution of Texas than it does in the United States Constitution. These issues are all handled by the federal judiciary, but the determination was made to put it in the Texas Constitution, perhaps to protect from a more liberal thinking judiciary. Since, interestingly enough, most of the judiciary, virtually all of the judiciary in the state of Texas is elected as opposed to appointed. And the fear was that the people's voice, even though they didn't have a whole lot of influence over the legislature, could have direct influence over the courts. So they put in a lot of detail here. The concept of habeas corpus, you recall that the government can't take you into custody without providing you certain rights and remedies. And you remember in the US Constitution, it said that habeas corpus can be suspended in the event of invasion or insurrection. The Texas Constitution makes it clear. It basically says exactly that. The writ of habeas corpus shall never be suspended. No circumstances where habeas corpus shall be suspended. That is what's known as de jure. It's written here in the Constitution. It's the law. In fact, in actual practice, are people denied their habeas corpus rights in the state of Texas? And the answer probably is yes. No excessive bail. That's nothing. Right to trial by jury. Nothing to significantly different from the US Constitution. Um, okay, this concept of eminent domain. And for those of you who are around for our first run through with with the U.S. Constitution, you remember that eminent domain, that's the right of the government to take away property of private property for a public purpose unless an appropriate amount of compensation is paid. That's basically eminent domain. And I gave you the instance of Jerry Jones wanting to build his football stadium in Arlington, Texas. And what he basically said was, I should have the right to get this land under eminent domain because even though we're taking private property, but there's a public purpose for it. It's not for my private stadium. The public purpose is that it's going to raise tax revenue, it's going to create new jobs, it's going to redevelop a downtrodden community. So that's the public purpose that allows me to take the land of all these poor people so I can build my $1 billion stadium. And I told you that the state of Texas didn't like that. It's here in the Bill of Rights, the amendment in 2009. And I'll read you the pertinent part of this. When a person's property is taken under this section, except for the use of the state, compensation shall be first made. That's not that is not the section that I wanted. Okay, the restriction. Taking the property, the taking shall be only for the purpose of, that's not the part I want to talk about either. It essentially says that taking private property under eminent domain for a business use shall not be permitted. I'm looking for the actual language here. I should have underlined that. Okay, here it is. In this section, public use does not include the taking of property for transfer to a private entity for the primary purpose of economic development or enhancement of tax revenues. That is what's known as the Jerry Jones Amendment. That was a slap in the face to him. Now, I see we're getting close to the end of the time. This is probably a good place to stop. We'll spend a little bit more time on these rights under the Bill of Rights, although some of the rest of them are, again, just technical, not that important. Although, let me just skip ahead to this one. Bill of Right number 32, this is the language I was just speaking about. Marriage in this state shall consist only of the union of one man and one woman. That was a constitutional amendment in 2005. It is now 2020. That's still in the Constitution of Texas, even though the United States Supreme Court said that you could not enforce that. And then here's our latest amendment to the Constitution. You'll probably remember voting on this. The right to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife. The people have the right to hunt, fish, and harvest wildlife, including by the use of traditional methods to conserve and manage wildlife and preserve the future of hunting and fishing. So they can't regulate a person's right to hunt and fish under the Constitution. I think that really pretty much covers the Bill of Rights. We'll get into let's see, Article 2. I briefly mentioned before. This is one of the shortest articles of the Texas Constitution, and it basically says The powers of the government of the state of Texas shall be divided into three distinct departments, each of which shall be confided to a separate body, to wit, it basically creates legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. It says here in writing where it's explicit, whereas it's only implied in the US Constitution, that there is a complete separation of powers between these three branches. That pretty much takes us through the Bill of Rights. Article 2, of course, very, very short. Article 3 is the creation of the legislative branch, which is what we were going to take up next week. Similar to the US Constitution, most attention in the Texas Constitution was focused on the state legislature. So we'll talk in detail about what they created and talk about why they created it. Some of those features are 150 years out of date, but we're still stuck with them. Some of the features arguably should be changed, but we'll actually have some discussion there. Now, the section on the legislative branch is the longest section by far. It's almost 80 pages long. Don't worry about that. We're only going to be talking about maybe 8 things that are really important. And the rest of it is just really, really highly technical. With that, I'm going to ask Lena if you can unmute everybody, and let's see if there are some questions. I see it. There might be some chat questions.
Let's see.
What do we do about next week when the Democratic convention is on?
Very good point. Yeah, because that runs through Monday through Thursday.
Right.
I think we will just have to postpone it for a week because we all want to watch that. And, they didn't ask me whether the timing interfered with anything I wanted to do. So I guess we'll have to go with their timing. So, I think we'll have to postpone next week and move to the following Tuesday, the following Wednesday, where we'll pick up on the legislative branch. Which there's some really fascinating things, but we're not going to go through the entire portion in detail, just the salient parts. I know I went through a whole bunch of stuff pretty quick here. Is there anything that any of you find you have a question about, or?
Bob, well, in Washington, Trump does whatever he wants, disregards the Constitution, basically says, what are you going to do about it? And everybody kind of shrugs their shoulders. There's no enforcement capabilities there. Anything to say about the Texas Constitution about enforcement if a body is out of line?
Well, in actuality, let's give the federal government a little more consideration here. They do have the power. Congress has the power to do things, and if the president tries to block it, in theory, Congress has the power to do things. But if the president says no, if he vetoes something, then a veto can be overridden, but it requires 2/3 vote by both houses. And you're not going to get 2/3 vote in the United States Senate for anything against anything that Trump doesn't like. The enforcement power is there through the judiciary. And you can see this is the thorn in the side of Donald Trump, is that the judiciary keeps telling him repeatedly over and over and over again, you do not have the authority. You are assuming that you have the ability to do things that you do not have to do under the US Constitution. And so case after case, he keeps losing in federal court. And surprisingly, even though the Supreme Court is now a 5-4 conservative majority, Trump has lost a lot of big cases in front of the United States Supreme Court this year. 2 years, well, no, he lost a lot before when it was like a 4-4 with Kennedy as the deciding vote. So in actuality, there is a lot of power at the federal level to block Trump, and they're doing it.
But, let me specifically, in Oregon, he sent in the military, which of course is prohibited under the Constitution. They're supposed to defend the United States. But basically, you put it.
But the thing is,
screw you, I'm going to do whatever I want to do.
yeah, and the states are pushing back on it. Federal courts, because this only started, what, about 4 months ago or so? So the federal courts, it hasn't worked itself up to an appellate court level. The president of the United States, well, first of all, what Trump is doing, he's not calling out the quote unquote military. He's calling out quote unquote law enforcement, officers of Health and Human Services and officers of Homeland Security. They're not military. They're quasi-military, and a court might say, especially in terms of, you know, we've, in American history, we've generally been able to determine, is this law enforcement? Are these the guys that are dressed in blue and who are here to protect us from bad things? Or are these military and wearing military uniforms and camouflage and carrying military weapons? You know, the distinction used to be pretty clear. I've heard a number of commentators say that under George W. Bush, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security is probably a huge mistake. That trying to bring all of these different forces under the control of basically one cabinet member, and which the President of the United States has under his thumb, that it's a problem. We know that the military, Secretary of Defense Esper and the Joint Chiefs of Staff guy, Milley, has both said that they will not allow the military to be politicized, that their job is to protect the country essentially from foreign invasion and to help out in an emergency, like if there's a tornado or a hurricane or something like that, you know, to help out in those circumstances. But it's my understanding that if you talk to most folks in the military and even folks in the police department, you understand they have been trained for their job completely differently. And the military knows their job is not police enforcement. They're not trained for it. It's not a function of the military, and they want to stay out of it. And Esper's made it pretty clear. He doesn't want to get, you know, pulled into anything domestic. He recognizes, or, you know, his belief, which I think is most people's belief, the purpose of the military is to protect the country from invasion or, you know, from some sort of interference from outside, and not to be used domestically.
If I can just jump in here for a moment and go back to your original question about Trump just getting away with anything. He just does whatever he wants to, and why can't we stop him? It all comes down to the fact that you have to go through the court system. He does something and somebody has to challenge that, and so that's not constitutional. And that has to then work its way up. And some cases it's worked its way up pretty quickly, but in a lot of cases it just takes a lot of time. So that's why we've got to elect somebody else and get a whole different judiciary going there to stop this crap.
And I'd like to add a little something to that. The judiciary, we know, is a slow-moving, plodding organization by intent, that everything has to be carefully considered. you need to bring in the viewpoints of all sides to make sure that especially the judiciary doesn't want to step in and try and step on the powers given to the other branches of government. So they're very reluctant to do that. But in an emergency, the Supreme Court takes care of these problems. You have the 1974 issue with President Nixon, the water thing, and those tape recordings. And it plodded along a little bit.
Yeah.
But pretty quickly, it got to the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court unanimously, that was the most amazing thing, unanimously told Richard Nixon, you have to turn over those tapes. And he turned them over. To his credit, he could have burned them. But, you know, with all of the negativity you can raise about Richard Nixon, and, you know, that you disagree with a lot of what he stood for, he did respect the United States Constitution. He did respect the United States government. As soon as he lost, he said, okay, I lost. There's no more places to go to fight this. Here are the tapes, and here's my resignation.
Okay,
So-
well, we are well over our time limit here and we're losing people. I will let you know that I will be putting this onto the Professor Franklin's YouTube site, but I'll send out the link to that as soon as I get that done, hopefully tomorrow. So if anybody's got any last minute whatevers,
A very quick thing that Trump may have learned from the Jewish people. On Sukkot, which we build these tabernacles, you know, a Jewish person built one on his front lawn, and which is illegal. Okay, well, the code enforcement gave him 10 days to remove it. Of course, the holidays is only 8 days long.
that's the law for you.
Sometimes judges do things to get to what they want without, you know, they can bend the law just by using some of the rules and regulations. And oftentimes it's done for good reasons.
We watched a movie last night that was A Bridge Too Far, and there was a rather interesting, funny thing that where this this soldier pulled a gun on the doctor saying, if you don't look at my friend here and, you know, give him an examination, I'm going to shoot you. Well, it turns out he looked at him and it turns out he wasn't dead. But then the doctor brought him over to an MP and said, I want you to arrest this person and then count to 10 and then let him go. so that's called discretionary stuff, I guess. But anyway, we're going to say goodbye. Y'all have a good time.
Okay, so we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay, bye.
Good night.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.